Here we go. So welcome once again to one of our panels for the 50 Plus Shades of Gothic conference series organized by PubMed Research. Today's panel is entitled Dislocating Identities, the Psychology of the Gothic House. And I am thrilled to introduce our three participants who are going to deliver some fascinating presentations on this topic. Before getting into it, I'd like to remind the audience that there will be a Q&A session after the presentations. And until then, we kindly ask you to please keep your cameras off and your mics muted so that everything goes smoothly, and then you'll be able to turn them on for the Q&A. And lastly, I would like to remind everyone participating today, audience included, that this is a recorded session that will be uploaded to YouTube. So bear that in mind if you do not wish to appear online. And that's all for me. And so let's get on with our wonderful presentations. First up, we have Carmen Méndez García. She's an associate professor of American literature at the Department of English and American Literature at the Complutense University of Madrid. Her current research and teaching interests include 20th and 21st century US literature, postmodernism and contemporary fiction, the counterculture in the US, spatial studies, gender studies, and minority studies, especially Chicano studies. And today she's presenting a paper entitled A House to Grow Old In, Aging, Spaces, and Evil in the Haunting of Hill House from 2018 and American Horror Story, Murder House. Whenever you're ready, Carmen.
Thank you so much, Sofía. I'm so happy to be here. And I would like to start by thanking the organizers for this very inspiring series and format. I am feeling a lot of responsibility today because I have listened to some excellent talks already. But you know, it's a sunny day outside my window and it looks like one shouldn't be afraid, even if I am going to be talking about haunted houses. So here it goes. I am organizing my thoughts today in connection with other topics as they have been appearing in the series. I have noticed, for example, this is pretty obvious, that space and time were often mentioned in relation to the Gothic and specifically to dwellings in a number of talks. What made me start thinking about the ideas I will be developing today is how there is an overwhelming production, both in cultural texts and the analysis of them, of the tradition of American Gothic houses as reflecting mental illness, of course, starting with post the fall of the House of Usher in the US. That is to say, the house in the Gothic mode seems to be portraying mostly psychological states. The way the building looks reflects on the mind or the psychology of its inhabitants. This made me start to wonder whether the deterioration in some cases in the genre could be not only of mind, but of body. That is to say, whether the aging of the inhabitants and the house could also be reflected. I would like to signal before I go into my analysis that I will be talking today about a very specific kind of house, not the suburban Gothic, which I have studied elsewhere, but rather the old mansion or the old family house. Also, I will be studying it not in the sense of the ancestral home where the family has lived for generations, because none of the two shows I will be analyzing qualify. I will be studying it in the sense of a house inhabited by new owners trying to ignore its history. The difference to me lies in the difference between the noble house with a capital H, that is to say the family line, such as the House of Usher again, and the home, that is to say the place where a specific nuclear family, not of noble origin, tries to bond and to live, but which has not been part of the family until that moment. I will, of course, be basing my analysis in the absence in American fiction of the two most prominent buildings in classic Gothic in the UK and Germany, that is to say the monastery and the haunted family castle. These buildings do not exist, or at least not with the same kind of authenticity given by old age in the US. So the next good thing is the old Victorian mansion. And one could argue that these Gothic mansions are born old in the sense that they are made to look imposing and reflecting the family's standing, also often legitimizing their status in the case of the new rich. This, of course, plays nicely with one of the main tenets of the Gothic tradition. The older something is, or the older something looks, the more time for tragic or mysterious or evil things to have taken place in them. For example, I'm going to be sharing my screen here with you. Okay, I'm gonna try and make it okay. For example, what you have here is a photo of the mansion that was used to film American Horror Story Murder House, which is a Tudor and Gothic revival by Alfred Rosenheim. The house actually exists. Since I will be analyzing two very contemporary texts, I would like us to consider the place that the old mansion occupies as an oddity, I would say, in 20th and 21st century America. The US is, of course, a country that suffers, often to an obsession, from a lack of history as compared to other parts of the world. But also after World War II and the rise of consumerism, the US became the paradigm of the modern, the new, the shiny. The old mansion does reflect money, but it also often incorporates in cultural products in the 20th century the additional meaning of being something from the past, maybe frozen in time. And this is, I think, an uncomfortable place indeed for these buildings to exist and occupy. I would like to continue by pointing out some common elements in both series as in connection to the house. Firstly, both portray new starts in old houses. They are specifically about families that need to start anew because something has happened. Both families are middle class, and they are both a nice example of the nuclear white family. There are texts about Gothic houses and race, but these are not those. Secondly, both houses follow what I could call the Dorian Gray metaphor. That is to say, there are like basements and hidden rooms. They are old and decrepit, and they work as a metaphor of what the house really is. And I say this in comparison to the renovated exterior, which may be, if you want, facelifted. Just like Dorian Gray may look perpetually young, while his hidden portrait is aging, mansions may be restored, they may be renovated, but the accumulation of experiences and events, which, for example, in American Horror Story include murder and illegal abortions, those events and the accumulation, they are still there in the part of the house that does not usually get to be seen. Finally, both houses are obviously too big for a nuclear family, but they can hold many ghosts. I think there's space here for a reflection on ownership, especially as owning a certain kind of house is in line with having made it, with the American dream. So we could ask, who are the owners? The family, who are only temporary tenants, or the many ghosts who have lived and died there before? Now, and this is like the main part of my talk, I will be focusing on aging, bodily ailments, and the passing of time. The mansion in American Horror Story promises a new start. The imposing exterior has been cleaned, the main rooms renovated, but the house is not new, and it is haunted by the ghosts of the people murdered there. In that sense, American Horror Story is not too surprising in narrative sense, but it does set the tone for the whole anthology series. It is very localized, that is to say, the horror stories are very American. And I am mentioning this because someone asked the other day about the Americanness of a given text that was being analyzed. And in American Horror Story, for example, there are references to specific American historical events that are haunting the house. And of course, they didn't happen there, but the house like becomes this repository of awful American historical murders and horror. There's, for example, a school shooting. We find the Black Dahlia case, and even a plot that is clearly referenced in the kidnapping and murdering of Charles Lindbergh Jr. In a longer version of the paper, I would also like to analyze aging in American Horror Story. But for this talk, I feel that The Haunting of Hill House is more interesting since it is less cliched. And I think this is because it is less interesting in the Americanness of the experience, which becomes a little too much, I think, in American Horror Story. Also, I think that The Haunting of Hill House does extremely interesting things when it comes to aging, bodily functions, and illness, and the house as a body, not a mind, but a body. So, in The Haunting of Hill House, we find two timelines. The present in the 1990s, when what remains of the family get together after their suicide of one of the siblings, and a series of flashbacks into the 70s on the summer when the mother of the family died while they were living in Hill House. So the protagonists are in a way the children that are expelled or rescued from the house, and then they have to go back once they have grown outside the house and trying to escape its influence. The house stands for the family's past and possible illness, and it haunts them even when they are away. We can see this in these two posters that you have here from the series. In one of them, the house is made to be part of a human head, and in the other, the family is portrayed in front of the house in the past and in the present, expressing the passing of time. This will be the two main ideas of my next paragraphs. So the Cranes, the family that occupies Hill House in the 70s for one summer, they are flippers. That is to say, they are renovating the building, so it is restored to its former glory, not because they intend to live there. They are doing it so it can be sold and so that they will have the money to get what they keep referring to as their forever house. This is a very aspirational American endeavor, the concept of the forever house, as made popular by HGTV shows together with open kitchens. Those are like two things that people repeat all of the time. This forever house is something that the mother of the family, Olivia, who is an architect, sketches obsessively. She's obsessed with designing and getting this wonderful forever house for her family. Interestingly enough, at some point before her death, she starts trying to create a complete, well, this is what the house looks like, but this is what I wanted you to look at. At some point before her death, she starts trying to create a complete blueprint of Hill House. You have it here and you have it there too. And as you can see, the blueprint is obviously obsessive. It is unhinged if you want, which is of course an expression of Olivia becoming not only unhinged, but also being consumed, or I could say eaten, by the house. We could ask ourselves whether the mansion trying to murder and incorporate the cranes is due to jealousy, or rather perhaps to the realization on the part of the sentient house of how it is old, it is no longer fashionable, it is no longer relevant, and maybe this makes the house want to be the forever home for the family. It's also interesting to me how the forever home could have different meanings for each character or for each of the people and ghosts that we see. Not only for the members of the family, but also for the ghosts trapped there in Hill House already. And you know, it is like forever, forever, forever. Like for them, Hill House could end up becoming the real forever and final home beyond death. Also, I think the show features an interesting change in the tradition of psychological horror of the deteriorating house symbolizing the family's illness, which is often seen as mental decline. In the show, the Cranes are convinced that there is something bad in their blood, or one could say something mad, and even one of the siblings, Stephen, decides to get a vasectomy so that it will not be passed down onto the next generation. But in the end, there is nothing wrong with their blood or their sanity. Their maladaptation to adult or grown-up lives, their mental problems, are the effect of the house's actions and not the other way around, which is what I think is usually the most defining of Gothic. Interestingly, also, Hill House is portrayed as sentient and as an active perpetrator of evil, violence, and distraction. In this sense, it haunts, but it also hunts. It haunts the living versus the trope of the ghosts as hunters, which we can find, for example, in American Horror Story. In American Horror Story, and this is a very good representation of the way the Gothic usually works, the house is made evil by the generation of dwellers and the events in the house, by the things that people do. The house in the Haunting of Hill House, however, has always been evil, even before it was inhabited, and as a result of this inherent evilness, it has been bringing down and incorporating the living into itself through the ages. In the series, the house is defined as something that was not meant to be lived in, and also as just a carcass, maybe reflecting a process of wasting away in old age. Hill House stands, and we are told will always stand, stubbornly holding its ground on physicality past its prime and into old age. Moreover, we are told that the house has an appetite, and it could be even considered to be a vampire, which is like feeding on its victims and incorporating them. And there are many moments in the show when the house seems to be made of body parts. You can see, for example, here this spiral staircase. It looks like an eye. And we can also see here in this slide what is called the Red Room, which is one of those forbidden rooms that are so typical of the Gothic, that are not meant to be entered because something may happen. And this Red Room is described as the stomach of the house. One of the siblings says, Mom says that the house is like a body. This room is like the heart of the house. And then she corrects herself. She says, no, not the heart, stomach. The house then digests people. It is given corporeality and it's having to do with subsistence. So it has to be fed or find a way to feed itself. In her book, Film Horror and the Body Fantastic, published in 1995, Linda Badley analyzes Gothic representations of the body as responding as responding to contemporary anxieties of the 90s, such as AIDS or the fear of post-gender identities. And I think this rewriting of the house as needing to feed as a body clearly responds to our anxieties about aging or being able to age. My last point about the house in The Haunting of Hill House, as disrupting traditional tropes of what the old mansion stands for, is connected to how at the end of the show, the house refuses to burn. It refuses to be destroyed or to go away. The destruction of the evil house is a cliche in the old Gothic house narrative, so why is it subverted here? I think this could be connected to the house's stubborn old age that I mentioned earlier, And also in a show about the passing of time, getting old, and doing so in the context of the family or dominated by the memories of the family, Hill House finally stays in the family, like a family secret, like an aging or infirm or insane relative that has to be kept secret and apart from the world. Stephen decides to buy and keep the house, not to live in it, but to protect the ghosts and make sure that no one who is alive decides to move into the house. That is to say, the house stops being fed. Interestingly enough, it is Stephen's intention that the house will continue to get old, with no repairs or renovations, just wasting away, trying to prove its will to live in its old age without affecting or preying on the living. This is my last paragraph. My intention with this talk was to give some pointers as to my understanding of these two shows as family dramas about aging individually, as family members or as a house, but also about the passing of communal time, the anxiety not just about changing as an individual as we grow older, but also about the family dissolving or disintegrating when children become adults and leave their parents and their childhood house behind. Something that I would also like to explore in a different talk is the possible ageism in the old house as trope. The houses in general in the Gothic seem not to become wiser or to settle into their bones or to become more understanding or welcoming in their old age. If extrapolated to people, this would be the equivalent of always portraying old people as evil or being made worse and not better by the experience of living. But that is a topic for a different talk. I hope I have proved today, in any case, that the analysis of the Gothic mansion can be built on a very fertile ground, pun intended, to portray our own anxieties about aging and changing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I'm really eager to see where the discussion goes later on. But now let's just move on to our next presentation by Ben Brown. Ben is currently completing a PhD at the University of Edinburgh, where he is focusing on the Gothic, and more specifically on Gothic doubling in the works of Thomas Pynchon. Today he's gonna discuss the Gothic too in a paper entitled Gothicizing the Home in George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. So yeah, I'm gonna look at, as Sophia said, the Gothic in Night of the Living Dead. And I want to look at not only how the film utilizes the Gothic tropes, but how it kind of adapts and in some ways critiques them by sort of placing them in the present, as opposed to often even the Gothic stems from the past. But to begin with, I just want to look at like the centrality of the setting within the Gothic and as a genre. And I think that's a really useful kind of quote to demonstrate that is one published in sort of the early 18th century, the late 18th century, as the Gothic was kind of establishing itself in it. And it actually concocts a recipe for writing a Gothic novel, suggesting that, quote, one take an old castle, half of it ruinous, a long gallery with a great many doors, some secret ones, 3 murdered bodies, quite fresh, and populate it with noises, whispers and groans, 70 at least. And while this recipe is quite a cynical contemporary response to these kind of works, it also does serve to kind of present an interesting blueprint of the Gothic literature and media that's sort of been created since the genre's inception in the 18th century. And even starting with these early texts like Walpole's The Castle of Otranto and Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and moving through later Gothic works such as Dracula, even right up to more contemporary texts such as Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle and Jennifer Egan's The Keep. These features, such as the old Gothic castle, half of it ruinous, 3 murdered bodies quite fresh, and noises, whispers and groans, have now become kind of synonymous with the genre itself. But these features also appear kind of in at least an adapted form in George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. And whilst the Gothic castle is kind of replaced by this isolated farmhouse in Philadelphia, at least by the end of the film, the farmhouse is half ruinous and containing, well, more than quite a few fresh murdered bodies. And possibly, as you can tell by the film's title, a few of the bodies aren't even that fresh by the end of the film. And so the presentation of these tropes does show a clear engagement with the Gothic mode, even if the locations may be different in appearance. I mean, obviously the farmhouse is far more impressive, far less impressive on a physical level than a ruined castle, but the sense of dread that surrounds this building is purely kind of Gothic in its nature. And it certainly contradicts the kind of presentation of the home in the American popular, in other American popular culture that Ray Broadus Brown sort of notes, that Americans have always had this place in their hearts for home and the concept of what it supplies in comfort and psychic reassurance. So there's always been this kind of idea in the American psyche that home is a place that can offer sanctuary from the horrors and stresses of the outside world. And in that sense, the farmhouse in Night of the Living Dead kind of does have a lot more in common with the old Gothic castle than this kind of white picket fenced kind of domestic sphere that Madeline Thomas believes was, and I quote, affluent, kind of emblematic of the affluent middle classes presented in 1950s television sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver. And what makes Thomas's kind of reading of this white picket fence society interesting is that it demonstrates how far Night of the Living Dead kind of strays from this preoccupation with middle class affluence that was so popular in the American media landscape at the time of the film's release. And by placing sort of the action in a representation of a contemporary rather than an archaic society, Night of the Living Dead also serves to demonstrate that the principles of like the ancient evil that appear in earlier Gothic works can be just as prevalent in contemporary society when it too is faced with the same potential collapse and ruin that these kind of archaic societies have also faced. And that threat that the house can manifest is kind of established from the outset. As Barbara, the character through which the house is introduced, enters this setting, it's shrouded in darkness, and you can kind of hear like thunder and see lightning in the background. So the film's also almost using this near cliche method of literally dark and stormy night to sort of situate itself within the Gothic mode. And after Barbara searches through the kitchen, she moves through the house and into this dining room, and at which point the film cuts quickly between the stuffed heads of animals on the wall, and that's accompanied by a sudden and musical eruption in order to sort of heighten the level of fear that's emitted by the location. So rather than focusing on the more homely features of the dining room, such as the dining room table or all the family trinkets on the sideboard, the film immediately draws focus to the physical manifestations of death that kind of already exist in the house. And as Barbara leaves this room and moves up the staircase of the house, the camera cuts again to this close-up, but this time it's of a rotting corpse kind of lying on the landing. And that close emphasis of this disfigured body further elevates the sense of psychological fear that was already kind of being hinted at by the taxidermized animals earlier on. And in fact, in Kate Ferguson Ellis's sort of understanding of the Gothic, she suggested the genre is preoccupied with the failed home, and she defines this as, quote, the place from which some usually fallen men are locked out and other usually innocent women are locked in. And this interpretation of the Gothic mode can also almost be used as like a synopsis for the situation that Barbara finds herself in here. She's an innocent woman who's locked in by the danger posited by the literally fallen men, the ghouls, if you like, attacking from outside. And so she finds herself trapped within this sort of interior psychological terrors of the farmhouse in order to escape the exterior physical dangers that these fallen men present. And this sense of being locked in by the outside is also kind of echoed in the news broadcasts that are peppered throughout the film. And during the first one, which takes the form of a radio broadcast, people are encouraged to, quote, stay in their homes behind locked doors and not to venture outside for any reason. So the initial message is that home is still the safest place. And you know, the film's protagonists should remain behind locked doors in order to preserve their own safety. Even if there are dangers in the house, they're still kind of overshadowed by sort of undead threat from the outside. But as the film progresses, this advice is changed. So in the second of these broadcasts, this time on television, the announcer indicates that people are now being advised to, quote, moved to rescue stations with food, shelter, medical treatment, and protection from armed National Guardsmen. So the level of danger that was kind of initially exclusive to the farmhouse and the protagonist's kind of own experience is extrapolated to include every home within the film. It sort of undermines Brown's assertion that the home is a place of comfort and psychic reassurance, because the list of sort of facilities that the newscaster documents, you know, food, shelter, and this kind of general protection are often indicative of what we would usually sort of class as the sources of comfort and psychic reassurance that are found in the home. And so when these elements are removed, so too is the sort of security that the home can afford to us. And at this point, the film ceases to kind of be about the terror that has manifested in a single home, and instead sort of becomes about the danger that exists and can permeate throughout sort of every home within the text. Kind of getting back to the farmhouse itself, though, the news kind of arrives too late for the protagonists, and as the film progresses, they're kind of led further and further into this sense of entrapment, kind of ironically, by the fact that they attempt to fortify themselves from the danger outside. And this is done through the destruction of of features that would normally provide comfort, such as tables, chairs, and doors. You know, they'd usually be the symbols of that sort of middle-class affluence, the idea that the nicer the furniture, the more affluent you are. They're kind of torn apart and repurposed purely for the function of survival. And as a result, the space properly starts to represent the decaying Gothic castles of the previous text, the fallen into disarray. And in her reading of the Gothic, actually, Gretchen Koernow suggests that the ruinous features of these structures is often indicative of the Gothic writer's focus on, quote, medieval life as a dark and barbarous era that's fallen into disarray and been replaced by more civilized beliefs of contemporary society. However, Night of the Living Dead kind of demonstrates just how fragile this seeming civility really is. As soon as the threat to survival is presented to the characters in the contemporary world, they too descend into this dark and barbarous actions that the Gothic would often like to believe has kind of been relinquished by humanity. And this loss of civility reaches a climax after a failed attempt to escape the house. Sorry, upon trying to re-enter, Ben, one of the disagreeing de facto leaders within the film, is prevented from doing so by the other leader, Cooper, who's locked the front door and is attempting to escape into the cellar. So what we see here is that the fear of death has caused Cooper to not only relinquish the comforts of home, but also his inclination to assist other human beings in need as well. And furthermore, if Ben were to die, it would sort of solidify his position as the singular leader of the group of survivors. So in terms of survival and ego, Cooper actually begins to resemble the Gothic villain that Juliet John believes can be characterized as putting personal before law, family, and community. And so Cooper's kind of disregard for the safety of others in order to satisfy his own personal agenda kind of fits within this characteristics of putting the personal above all else. But it also kind of calls into question the reading that Tyson E. Lewis has given of the film. And Lewis has suggested that, quote, Night of the Living Dead ends not with hope, but with the emergence of another truly terrifying nightmare, this time at the hands of the humans themselves. So in Lewis's reading, there's the suggestion that it's the end of the film where like a true loss of humanity starts to emerge in response to the ghouls' attack. But as we see with Cooper's sort of selfishness, this loss of humanity is often taking place throughout the course of the film. It doesn't just emerge at the end. It's always kind of underlying in particularly this character's response to what's going on. And it sort of demonstrates that just the ghouls are enacting their own sort of sense of self-preservation from the outside by eating the flesh of the living. By locking Ben with them, Cooper's enacting a similar methodology from the inside. And the loss of this humanity that Cooper demonstrates kind of reaches its peak when the house itself faces its greatest threat from the ghouls. So whilst Ben and Cooper's wife, Helen, attempt to hold up the remnants of the barricades, Cooper watches on in this frozen panic. And again, we see that Cooper only kind of considers his own safety, this time even in the face of the danger that's, attacking his own wife. And this inability or refusal to act continues until the gun that Ben has been holding is knocked from his hands. And at this point, Cooper immediately dives on the weapon and begins to threaten Ben and Helen to do as he says. So we see that, despite the clear danger that is positioned from the outside, Cooper's ego has now fully shifted to the self-preservation and control situation. And his refusal to help his own wife while these hordes kind of attack and break down the barricades of the house demonstrate the full extent to which his sense of humanity has been completely eroded. And at this point, Cooper's become just as animalistic in his survival instincts as the ghouls who attack from outside. So perhaps not unsurprisingly, it's actually at this point, or sort of shortly afterwards, that the house becomes entirely overwhelmed by the ghouls. And so just as the final embers of civility are extinguished within Cooper's mind, so too is this sense of safety that the house can provide. And there's no longer any escape or sort of promise of escape from the danger. And instead, the house turns into what Ben earlier described the house's cellar as, which is a death trap. And so whilst the house has long since been stripped of the ability to provide comfort, its homeliness, if you like, it can now no longer even provide the security that was kind of the illusion throughout the course of the film. And at this point, the reverse happens, where the house has always been dangerous to the protagonist, but the hordes of the undead were always posited as being the greater threat. But with this final assault, the structure kind of has this twofold effect of becoming genuinely ruinous in the same way the Gothic castle does, and at the same time, it's no longer something that locks the evil out. But with the sort of destruction of the final barriers, the house in fact becomes a space where evil has locked the protagonist in. And so what was once a place of, to come back to that comfort and psychic reassurance, is now transformed into a space of danger and hopelessness. And that kind of demonstrates that despite applying these kind of Gothic motifs and using the sort of similar constructs, and comparisons can easily be made between the house in Night of the Living Dead and these old Gothic castles. The film itself kind of shifts these thematic principles from the past to the present. So whereas the Gothic's always careful to indicate that the ancient and terrifying elements within the text are the products of the past, and when they do manage to break through into the contemporary age, they're kind of erased and defeated by this civilizing ideal of the present, particularly in sort of earlier works like especially in Radcliffe's kind of Gothic writing. But what Night of the Living Dead demonstrates is how closely the modern age kind of really is to this savage past that it wishes to leave behind. And as soon as the threat to survival manifests itself, even those who claim to be civilized, like Cooper, descend into this dark and barbarous action, as Cohen puts it, in order to satisfy this ever-present instinct for self-preservation. And so whilst the Gothic aims to demonstrate the modern age has the power to relinquish the savage elements of the past, what Night of the Living Dead is doing is revealing that in reality, whether we're living or the undead, we're only really one bad night away from sort of reawakening and fulfilling the animalistic nature that we'd like to believe no longer exists. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Ben. I really, really loved your take on Romero's classic. Now let's just get on with our last presentation by Natalia Kapytko. She is the head of the English Stylistics Department at Minsk State Linguistic University and lectures on several topics like contemporary tendencies in literatures in English and on English stylistics, English for professional communication, or British and American studies. Her paper today is entitled Weirdness and Displacement at Home as Depicted in Joyce Carol Oates' Gothic Novels. Over to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Sofia, for your wonderful introduction, and hello to everyone from Minsk, Belarus. I'm really happy to participate in this great event, and I would also like to thank all the organizers for your great work. It's really very amazing what you do for this span of time. This is something unimaginable. Thank you so much. All right, let me talk about broader literary context. I mean, in a broader literary context, Gothic fiction itself can be viewed as a shadow image of the mainstream literature of the day. Even nowadays, when contemporary literary process is characterized by a high degree of inclusiveness and diversity, the status of Gothic fiction is still very ambivalent. The fiction written by one of the most distinguished American authors of the late 20th or early 21st century, Joyce Carol Oates, who was born in 1938, blends the psychological and the supernatural in a manner that is distinctive of the traditional English ghost story on the one hand, and much recent fiction in the genre. So her novels of the Gothic experimental cycle, which include Bellefleur, published in 1980, A Blood's-Moor Romance, published in 1982, Mysteries of Winterturn of 1984, and My Heart Laid Bare, published in 1998, present characters whose previous moral and psychological conceptions of reality are shattered by evidence of the paranormal or of psychological revelation, or most importantly, of disintegration. Viewed from the perspective of the individuation process, disintegration can be regarded as a necessary stage in the protagonist's psychological transformation. And here we should pay attention to such archetypes as the shadow and a troublesome quest, which invariably includes the encounter with one's shadow. So the shadow is the darker side of one's unconscious self, the inferior and less pleasing aspects of the personality which one wishes to suppress. According to Carl Gustav Jung, I quote, taking it in its deepest sense, the shadow is the invisible reptilian tail that man still drags behind him, end of quote. According to his theory, the shadow belongs to the archetypes, or I quote, primordial images that still make up the groundwork of the human psyche. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. Wisdom is a return to them, end of quote. Thus, a Jungian reading of Joyce Carol Oates' Gothic novels enable us to fully understand the significance of the shadow archetype in revealing the night side of the protagonist's psyche that is caught in a painful process of individuation. And what is important here, we're discussing Gothic spaces and their relevance to interpreting Gothic fiction and films and culture. So this is the space and homes which become these shadows, as well as well, those ideas which were mentioned by our previous presenters connected with the house, which is viewed as a body, or a body as a house, and how these notions can be viewed in terms of shadow archetypes. Thus, this psychological process, I mean the process of individuation, can be well exemplified on Joyce Carol Oates' Gothic novel, The Mysteries of Winterturn of 1984. So the three cases that constitute the novel represent the variations on the enigma of the self and its transformations in the process of individuation. The protagonist, Xavier Kilgarvan, starts his detective career when he's 16. In The Virgin in the Rose Bower, or The Tragedy of Glenmore Manor, he tries to discover who has committed the murders and why. In other words, he reconsiders the standards of objective rationality, but he soon learns the limits and the dangers of such a mode. Xavier displays a progressively disturbed vision as he falls in love with his cousin Perdita Kilgarvan. She teases him cruelly, inviting him to a secret room in her family house and then locking him there full of doubts and unconscious fears. Later in the novel, Xavier Kilgarvan is unable to dismiss the signs of incestuous relationship his rich uncle had with his own daughter. Therefore, he protects his cousin's honor by deliberately withholding some unspeakable evidence to make further investigation impossible, and in this way to undermine his own creed. However, as the novel starts, Xavier is quite optimistic about doing away with crime and saving his community from evil, thus sharing 19th century America's belief in inevitable progress. Even his first name implies that he sees himself as a savior, a Christ-like figure of the town of Winterthur. Hence, relying on Jungian theory of individuation, Xavier Kilgarvan's persona might be viewed as inflexible and immature. On the surface, it is the social mask of an independent, self-reliant, professional and calm man, with all the connotations brought about by an image of a self-made American. In truth, however, Xavier is much more biased and conventional than self-confident and free. His detective activities, for example, are motivated by his teenage ambition for self-assertion. The protagonist's fear and failure to recognize his own burgeoning sexuality are emphasized when he's confronted with his shadow self in the form of supernatural vampiristic creatures while trying to detect the mystery of Glenmore Manor. They attack Xavier in a hallucinatory state he experiences in the first part of the novel and might be interpreted as another indication of his spiritual immaturity and lack of integrity. Just as Xavier's persona has proved inadequate in mediating between his ego and the external world, which is introduced as hostile, frightening, and incomprehensible, so his anima fails in relating to his inner worlds. It is highly suggestive that his soulmate or anima should be named Perdita, that in Spanish means lost. His trouble is that he sees his cousin Perdita Kilgarvan not only as a true life companion, such as a wife, but as an evil, treacherous mother who abandons him when he most needs her support. In other words, if a young man's anima is characterized as the evil mother, or rather the mother who is missing or lost, as Perdita's name emphasizes, then he might be expected to indulge into his juvenile escapades. But mature relations like marriage that occurs only at the end of the novel presuppose responsibility of both parties to keep their sacred vows. In Jungian terms, Xavier Kilgarvan experiences a failure of personality integration until the final reunion with Perdita, when he realizes his errors and misconceptions and works maturely for a reconciliation. So this dark image and dark imagery is well, it permeates the whole novel and can be associated with all of the parts. For instance, at the end of the novel, when Xavier Kilgarvan makes his night sea journey in search of a ruthless ex-murderer, he tries to find him everywhere and he assumes all kinds of identities. As Carl Gustav Jung proves in Psyche and Symbol, the results of the projections the protagonist falls a victim to are often disastrous for the individual. So the implications of isolation and frightening replicas are further reinforced in Joyce Carol Oates' novel by means of supernatural imagery and through Gothic doubles or doppelganger. As Sigmund Freud suggests in his paper, The Uncanny, I quote, "The double has become a thing of terror, just as after the collapse of their religion, the gods turned into demons." There is a phrase in the first part of the novel that strangely echoes Sigmund Freud's concept of the fearful double. I quote from the book: "Angels may turn demon with the passage of time, if starved of the love that is their sustenance." End of quote. These words of Perdita anticipate numerous shadow transformations that will occur to Xavier in the course of the book. As the plot unfolds, the protagonist experiences the collapse of his individual beliefs more than once, that invariably results in the discovery of evil in himself. But since Xavier's detective creed is deeply rooted in the conviction of his righteousness and the necessity to detect the source of the external evil, he encounters with his doubles are characterized by increasing intensity and quality of being more internalized. If in the second part of the novel, entitled Devil's Half-Acre, or The Mystery of the Cruel Suitor, Xavier's double is a merciless serial killer of a factory girl's Valentine Vestergaard, who calls himself the protagonist's sweet doppelganger, and through this definition emphasizes their kinship in the criminal context as that of a murderer and detective. Then in the third part, Xavier faces almost complete personal disintegration caused by his total identification with his double, embodied here in the mysterious character of one of the suspects. And so the concept of this enclosure and shadow and dangers which are enclosed in those enclosed limited spaces is further emphasized in the third part. Thus, the concept of eventual enclosure is emphasized by the mindscape of Winterturn. This is the town where the protagonist tries to solve all the three cases that are either directly or indirectly connected with his own family. So that a concept of the mindscape of Winterturn that is at odds with its physical landscape. Trusting his ability to easily find his way in this charted territory, Xavier Kilgarvan first is nearly trapped in a secret dungeon where he is lured into by his anima perdita. In his second adventure, reaching for a carefully planted glove as a piece of evidence, Xavier slides into quicksand unmapped on any chart and toward a terrible and inevitable death. Having touched bottom and escaped, though the reader never learns precisely how, he seems always confused about his direction. His third adventure leads him to the weird underground rooms of a house symbolically named the Hotel Paradise, a disturbingly labyrinth-like building that, as noted, stands for the darkest corners of Xavier's unconscious. Hoping to find the murderer in its gloomy and frightening passages, the protagonist is confronted with the traces of his own guilt, represented through the imagery of its numerous haunted rooms. Thus, Winterturn is Xavier's home ground, and paradoxically enough, that region, I quote, at least in his imagination, that could not be comprehended or ever solved, end of quote. And to conclude, I've mentioned that in Mysteries of Winterturn, the man of reason, represented by the protagonist, whose only greatest ambition in life is to become a famous detective, is hostage both to his affections and his mental powers. As Joyce Carol argues, I quote, Xavier Kilgarvan, as idealist and lover, is the quintessence of the late 19th century sensibility, end of quote. But his scrupulous attention to detail is also directed within. Being too perceptive, he is finally trapped in numerous inexplicable fissures and ravages, witness to atrocities and abuses of justice. And this novel artistic ingenuity is also linked with representation of darker realms of human psyche. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for that, Natalia. And now we can just move on to the Q&A bit. So as always, you can either raise your hand and then I'll call out your name and you can turn your cameras and mics on, or if you prefer, you can just type your questions on the chat feature and I'll read them out live, whichever feels more comfortable. So yeah. If anybody isn't feeling up for it, I might have some questions. Yeah, so I can break the ice. I think I have a question for Carmen, if that's okay. I haven't seen American Horror Show at all, but I checked the premise on Wikipedia and I saw that the season begins with a move from Boston to Los Angeles. So I was wondering if the choice of LA as a setting has something to do with the Gothic in any way. I don't know if this is a stupid question, but I was just curious to see, yeah, choosing LA as a setting has any sort of relevance for the Gothic, you know, environment.
I don't think it's stupid at all. No, I think there are like some places in the US that are very much connected to horror, and you know, of course, the East Coast is one of them, and the West Coast is not quite as often connected to that, unless you are looking at the Pacific Northwest, which right now has like its own myth, if you want. I think they're moving to LA. It makes sense from a narrative point of view because it is like the husband has been unfaithful and they want to move away from as much as they can, right? So they go like to the other side of the continent. One thing that is interesting in the show, for example, is that people actually, as they do in LA, they jump into these murder tours and they stop by the house. And they take photos and they get told this is where this thing happened and then this other thing happened, right? And the protagonists are very disturbed by the thing, but they are not so much disturbed by these things having been happening there, but by how their privacy is kind of like being invaded by these people, like taking photos and like sitting in their bus, like in front of the thing. And I think there are a lot of comments in the show about LA and Hollywood and how that is like a place where things are not what they seem and where things happen having to do with people's ambition and people wanting to become actresses. Of course, the Black Dahlia case is there. So I think there are lots of like little references that have to do with LA. I also think that the showrunner is very much obsessed with Hollywood and LA. And I think it makes sense that that season is there. In other seasons in the series, they are American, but in other parts of America. But this one is like very LA centered. And I think it is also like this new start, like we are moving away from the land of the Gothic and ending in this other place where there is also like this history of murder. So I think that insinuation is there, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'm just curious because it's such a mediated place, you know.
Yeah.
Nothing is coincidental when you put it in LA. So yeah, I'll see the show eventually. Thank you.
Thanks.
Come on, people, don't be shy. I can ask another question. I was wondering, Ben, oh, we have a hand. Okay, I'll ask my very quick question and then I'll let Monica speak. I was wondering why you think that Night of the Living Dead is, you know, always cited as this classic, movie that is so representative of so many things. My idea is that it has to do with the fact that everything that happens in the 60s tends to become sort of an epochal kind of landmark, but I was just curious about what you could say about this.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I agree with you. I mean, there's obviously one of the big things is the ending of that film. The main character is African American and he's killed by the Southern white sheriff and that group. But Romero himself always maintained that that was just coincidence. So there is this kind of like, obviously never trust an author's intent or what they tell you, but yeah, I kind of agree with you that it does kind of get raised to this point of everything in it is a social critique. But I think that's kind of also why it is put on that pedestal, because it is possible to read it in that way, and whether or not it meant to make these social comments, I think it, regardless, encouraged others to take the same kind of to specifically make those kind of comments. Even Romero himself in kind of the later films. So I think, yeah, like it not only is it kind of influential in the horror genre in the sense that it is one of the earliest zombie films, if you like, but also it does stem from that kind of late 60s, early 70s move to kind of social critique, you know, as sort of history's kind of shown us, you know, was tied up in the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff. So I think it was just a time of social change, and whether or not it was intentional, that is certainly a film that kind of has come to represent that ideal.
I absolutely agree. Thank you. Now we have a question from Monica.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your talks. Very interesting and yeah, well delivered talks. I think I'm losing my connection. That's why I didn't ask before. But well, maybe I can type it on the chat if you can't listen to me correctly. I'll just try. Right. So I think you've mentioned some things about what I'm going to say, but I was just wondering if you could develop a bit on that, like maybe regarding to what sort of unites all of your talks, which I think had some points in common, like in all these talks about the Gothic that we've been having and keynote lectures, and there was mentioned that compared to Gothic in some European and non-European countries, in the United States, there's always an anxiety about transgression from inside, whereas maybe I was thinking about a book on Polish Gothic. In one of the interviews we were doing, it's not published yet, it was mentioned that ruins and Gothic tropes are more about invasion from the outside, because yeah, of course, like the history of each place has its own particularities. So in the case of the United States, it has a complex history of internal paranoia and fear of an internal revolution. So I was thinking if there is something about that in all the three of the projects that you were exploring, which I think were all very creepy, very easy to analyze through psychoanalysis of this sort. And I don't know if you think about that.
Can I answer the question? Monica, thank you for your question. It's really very insightful, because as for American Gothic, it is different. And I think we've been mentioning this during our talks and those who made their presentations before, in terms of that horror that comes both from the outside and the inside. And I think it's also important to take into account that religious, paranoia, which comes back to the roots of American Gothic and deals with that Puritan vision of the world. And that in puritanical mode, there were some select few who were predestined for heavens, and others, they were doomed to hell. And I think that originally it also influenced that development of psychological Gothic and the danger danger that comes from within. And that's why one more factor here, we are talking about Gothic home, and that place, I think that Ben put it quite to the point, the fact that place that used to be a sanctuary, or which is viewed like that, becomes something really very dangerous and foreboding. And that idea of escape, and that idea of the fact that it's not only some limited space, and that feeling of claustrophobia, which contributes to the Gothic fear, but also the fear that lies outside in those great territories which are undiscovered and which were totally new and full of all kinds of dangers for the European settlers when they came to the American continent. I think that all these fears, the subconscious fears, they still find their way in the contemporary Gothic fiction. And talking about Joyce Carol's, whom I investigate, well, she focuses also on experimentation with the traditional modes of Gothic. That's why, on the one hand, she upholds them. Well, she uses these traditional models, and on the other hand, she shows how they are renovated, how they work on the unconscious level, at the same time how they differ and what happens to them in the modern times. Thank you.
Such a good answer. It's like going through a lot of the history of the United States. I've really enjoyed your answer. Thank you very much. Yeah, of course. The witch, yeah, well, you've moved on, but as you started talking, I was thinking about the witch hunts, that it's a recurring trope in the country, like not only the Salem witch hunts, but prospective witch hunts that have occurred. And yeah, I was really not thinking about the Puritans, but at the moment you mentioned it, it becomes quite obvious. So there is something very particular about the American Gothic that deals with scapegoating and with suspicion about your neighbor, about yourself as well. So thank you very much. I just really enjoyed it. I don't know if anyone else wants to contribute. Just wanted to say it was a really nice.
I was thinking of something that, I mean, I totally agree with what Natalia just said, and how, rather than answering, I'm going to move it towards Ben, a question that I was going to ask him, but I think this is related. So I think the house, the family house or the home, I think it is very American in a number of ways. You know, it is like aspirational, it is like the American dream, it is like making it, is like being able to afford a nice house. And I think that may be different from other houses. I'm not saying that people in other places don't want to have like a nice home, but I'm saying that it is like very much defining of who you are to be able to afford a certain kind of house. And, you know, I think that post 1950, also because we are so dominated by US visual culture, we have been encountering like the house as the place for the Gothic. But I was thinking, as Ben was talking, about Dawn of the Dead. And what he was saying about this, the house, the cottage as a safe place, which I totally get. This is the place where the zombies are not going to go in. We have to stay here. And I find it so interesting what George Romero is doing with Dawn of the Dead, because he's saying the mall is a safe place, because that is the place where we buy, and that is the place where we become ourselves, and nothing bad can happen to us there. And of course, you know, bad things happen. But it is funny how it looks like what he's saying about the American identity is you are safe in your home, and if not, where you are safe is in the mall, and nothing bad can happen in the mall, because that is where we celebrate a certain kind of America. So I don't know, this is like a comment, I guess, but I don't know, Ben, if you have anything to comment on that, if you plan on like comparing both movies at some point, or?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think actually when I first read The Call for Papers, I thought Dawn of the Dead first, but I thought Night of the Living Dead kind of fit a bit more. And yeah, there's definitely a sense in Dawn of the Dead where it is this idea that the mall is safe because that's where we consume and can sort of satisfy this need to consume. But there's also that scene in Dawn of the Dead where one of them says, why they still hear the zombies, and that the answer is they don't know why, they just come. And it's that sort of idea of the need to consume, in both the sense that the zombies need to consume the humans, like physically consume them, and this need to consume through financially and through purchase. But even kind of on top of that, the idea that the mall is a place where you can, or the idea of the mall is a place where you can buy anything, and therefore you could maybe reinvent yourself in a way. And so once they clear out the mall of the zombies, they kind of set up their own little community in a way that they don't really in Night of the Living Dead. So I think maybe there is that kind of idea of, I guess, time to kind of bring it back to what I was kind of saying about the Gothic and the progression of like the movement away from the past into the future. There's this idea that the mall could be the source of this new society that gets built over the one that's been destroyed by this catastrophic apocalyptic event. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, of course it does. When you're talking about this, it just came to my mind some very not particularly very intellectual comment, but I think apart from all the anxieties about national identity or consumer society that we can deduct from this projects, it also speaks to viewers in a very direct way, because I was just talking about this with my students yesterday when we were studying the 1950s and levee towns and suburbanization in America. And this is a massive generalization, of course, but we started talking about when we were like teenagers and we went to the United States in school exchanges. And I know it's not like this everywhere, but I went to a suburb, and the comment I was making is we were in houses, and then we went to the mall and we took the cars to go to these places. And it was a bit different from the kind of things we used to do in Spain as teenagers, like maybe we could go to the park, walking from our houses. And of course, again, this is generalizing quite a lot, and it was not criticism, because I was also saying, well, American teenagers are like more used to behaving in a different ways when they're allowed to go into their friends' houses and speak with the parents. That I think, at least in Spain, sometimes it's a bit like, no, families, you can't come into my house because it's all tidy. It's like, you just go to the park. And the other activity was going to the mall. So without even trying to intellectualize these ideas, it also speaks to them, I think, as a society, because these places, you spend more, like a lot of time in them, maybe differently than in other societies. And like, I'm sorry about the huge generalizations, but I was just speaking about this yesterday. So it is certainly no coincidence, I think, that this is what defines these films or these books in comparison to others from like other backgrounds. So yeah, thank you very much. I think it's fascinating, like how it connects to everyday life.
No, I think kind of what you're saying as well, Monica, that in the UK as well, that I understand what you're saying about the sort of the divide between the parents and the children, if you like, how they were kind of talking. It was more kind of communal. Certainly in the UK as well, if you went to a friend's house, you would basically spend all of your time with that friend in their room, or I don't know, playing out in the garden or whatever. You didn't really sort of interact with the parents. And I wonder if maybe that is kind of where these tensions, even within the Gothic, American Gothic, kind of arise, is the sense that there is this almost greater level of freedom, in the sense that it's not as hierarchical as possibly it might be in the UK or Spain. But there's also the sense, back to that idea of the puritanical, that there has to be a point where we have to do something to separate everyone else out. So like the small scale kind of, even though the small scale kind of divides aren't as visible, obviously the large scale ones are a hell of a lot more visible than they might possibly be. Maybe not in the UK at the moment, but certainly in other spaces and cultures.
Well, thank you very much. We could go on forever. I think there's another question, and yeah, because just wanted to finish saying that because many critics would believe that family as an institution can also be sort of uncanny. So yeah, totally sort of like totally uncanny. So thank you very much to the three speakers. I'll just be here now.
For triggering such an interesting conversation. I think we have one last question from Anna.
Yeah, so I thought it was all very interesting, as I'm not really an expert on family nor particular on houses and haunted houses, but I was just thinking, what about the ethnic element in these narratives you've been talking about? Because clearly in Romero's work, you have, at least in the first film, you have this subversion in the characters and who is the person that saves the others or that has an agency in a certain moment of the film. And also how, on the other hand, series such those Carmen was talking about have kind of a marked whiteness to them. So I was just, I don't have a very specific question, but I just wanted to ask the three of you just a few words or a bit of a reflection on this kind of aspect in your texts, because I think that even if they're not really focused on these issues, ethnic related issues, they do have some little aspects that could be talked about.
Sorry, Carmen, I think your mic is off.
Oh, sorry. No, I was going to say that in the two texts that I mentioned, that I was analyzing, there is no ethnicity and race. I mean, to begin with, like the protagonists are white, and like most people are white. There are like no relevant characters who are not white. And I think the texts are actually making a point about what is considered to be the classic nuclear family in the 50s, which is not white, because that is not the way it is imagined to be. And I think the texts are kind of making a point about how maybe the house is also decay because this model of a family is also like in decadence. But I think there are like very interesting texts out there that do deal with these things. And one that I find absolutely fascinating is a movie, I think it's like 2019, 2020, it is called Antebellum. And this is about the plantation house, but it's not like a plantation house where the focus is not on the white owners. It is on, you know, the people who were enslaved and the people who suffered there who were Black. So I think there's a lot of use of Gothic houses and ethnicity in many contemporary texts. The two I analyzed, they are not it. They are trying to make a point about the white middle class family, but you know, there's like no ethnicity there unless you wanna come to the conclusion that these families kind of fail precisely because they are so white and so nuclear and so middle class. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think Us itself has the house part, in which its family has a very nice house, you know, and I don't know, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, but in Us, you know, like the white family, they have like this super beautiful house, but we are also, it is not like the other Black family is much poorer or much in worse shape than the other white family. I think Us is totally talking about issues of race, but I don't see it using space as much as it is using other things. And I think the most prevalent space or the much more interesting space there is like this subway / research lab. But yeah, you know, I mean, I think the Gothic and horror is like a perfect place to explore race, and Us does that, Get Out does that. I think very often maybe these kind of authors are not quite that interested in space itself, and they want to emphasize like the horrors of slavery, like historical space, maybe more than spatial space.
Mm-hmm. Can I say a couple of words here, Anna? Thank you for your question. This is really, I do agree with Carmen that this ethnic aspect is also a very important integral part of American Gothic, particularly American Gothic. And if I talk about that experimental cycle in the novels I've mentioned, well, as for Mysteries of Winterturn, that ethnic aspect is not foregrounded either. Though if you look deeper, there is one motive or subplot connected with one of the suspects, when there is the case, the murder, and the murder is really very cruel and very dark, representing the third part. The first suspect, who is an African American, and his chosen piece picked up, like automatically, just because he's different from the rest of that middle class society, which well, most of the characters of the novel belong to. But in the fourth book of the cycle, which was distanced from the rest of the cycle because it was published not in the 1980s but in the 1990s, 1998, the book which is called My Heart Laid Bare, actually bears that ethnic element, again associated with the fates of African Americans, because one of the adopted sons of the protagonist, who is an African American, actually the plot deals with confidence artist, the protagonist, who plays all kinds of roles, and he plays them, he assumes all kinds of identities to gain profit, to gain money, and to manipulate upper middle class and middle class of the American society of the late 19th, early 20th century, just to squeeze money out of them. And his adopted son, who is an African American, he's really very successful at this game of making money, playing that confidence game. And actually, closer to the end of the novel, he protests to his adopted father activities, and he starts his own confidence game, representing himself as an African prince who lives in the United States of America, and he becomes the leader of those racial protests. And actually, he dies as an African hero, African American hero. Well, I think that ethnic aspect is also, but it's not so much Gothicized in this Gothic novel, as rather that Gothic novel acquires an important social, political aspect due to the introduction of that character and representation of those racial problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Anna, and for everyone's answers. I don't know if you want to add something else, or we can just leave it at that.
I could just say something quickly about,
Sure.
I guess, Romero more generally. I know I touched on it briefly when we were talking about it, Sofia, but I was just thinking about how in all of the original trilogy, Night, Dawn, and Day, in every case, it's the African American character who survives to the end. It might even be African American character and the female characters who generally fare best. And I just think, whether it's intentional or not, I think that the Gothic does often work well as a place to explore these sort of tensions between ethnic minorities and minority, and within sort of other minorities as well, because it does offer the space for these questions to manifest themselves, in the sense that it's often sort of deliberately othering. So I think it gives the opportunity to create some distance between what's kind of the reality and the fantastical, if you like. I mean, I could be wrong, but I doubt there's a zombie apocalypse on the way. So this kind of so I think it provides a space to ask these questions in a way that doesn't necessarily negate the sort of serious, well, not serious. They're of course they're still serious questions, but the kind of more conventional frames of conversation.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking of your answers together. I was just thinking that there are some texts, at least I can think of one, that is the film Culture Shock 2019, that uses the fact that the suburban space and the house space is very middle class white America. It uses it to tell an ethnic story and to tell how assimilation works in the US. And I think that's also kind of interesting because it's somehow they don't really get to appropriate the suburb, but they get assimilated into it. So I think that might be, I mean, I would like to see more that they play with this idea, but usually it's just assimilated minorities that get really somehow englobated in the suburban white middle class neighborhood.
Thank you for that, Anna. So I think this is a good place to leave this today. And so thank you once again to the three participants today, Carmen, Ben, and Natalia. And I enjoyed this so much. I hope you did too. And thanks to the audience too for attending and for your wonderful questions. And yeah, have a great rest of the evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sofía, for managing us so well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.